I just want to sit here with you and wait till the video starts. You may have to go offline. Hi, I'm waiting on the top of the hour, but I wanted to get present and be here with you before you find your way onto the page. So we have maybe a half a minute. Well, we probably have 30 seconds um, before we're at the top of the hour. It's just really significant to me, these Facebook Lives. And I want to actually talk about writing, of all the strange things Tantra might ever talk about. And sometimes when I do these Facebook Lives, good morning, I do them to really mark a moment in time. So since I was 19, I've done what we might call psychic readings. Um, and I've had the honor to watch the evolution of human consciousness. And never has that evolution been more striking than it is now. And I'm really going to dedicate the beginning of this Facebook Live to people who might want to write. Because I don't think we realize that writing is evolving also. And that also, I need to let you know I don't have my headset or my earplugs today, so we might have outside sounds that permeate this video. But the title of this particular talk is You as the Mind of Creation. And I don't think we realize that we are actually experiencing ourselves as you, as the mind of creation. And that we could be going through some difficult times emotionally or mentally or even physically, although we're not going to address that right now, because the very way we construct thought and uh, what we're what we have a direct relationship with in the construct of thought is before us. I'm going to say that again. The thinking we've been thinking with didn't give us access to things that we now have access to. And the things we now have access to are energetic matrices or fields of energy that are putting pressure on the neuroplasticity of the human brain, forcing the neural patterning of the human brain to be able to think in a manner that thinking has not occurred before. Our brain is a survival mechanism. It functions to keep you in survival. It is past based. So any thoughts from the past, any conclusions, any concepts, anything that's been recorded, we hear it as thinking, but it's actually recorded more like a computer, like a neural network that captures a matrix of thought and literally holds it in your uh, response mechanism of thought in your brain. So we are thinking through the lens of past thinking. And as much as you identify that thinking as you thinking, instead of past thinking based on what thinking thought so that you could survive, you can find yourself in a difficult time. That's why the creation exercises during this time are vital, obsessively so, because it's the only answer I have actually found that allows your thinking to reestablish itself in thought that is in your mind of creation, not in the past based survival thought that your thinking thinks. Past based survival thought was like always warning you that you were too stupid, warning you that you were too slow, warning you that you were not able, because it doesn't know how you perceive those thoughts is that something's wrong with you. You need to come off. My network connection's going, Heather. Heather and I are sharing a network out in the boonies. Um, so the so what's rising is a personality system that has been formed by thought, and that personality system has survived because it identifies with thinking. It's thinking as this is me. This is me thinking this, not this is thinking me. What is now beginning to occur is thinking that isn't, but particularly those of you who are working in the creation exercises, and this is where it really gets strange, because you can start to say, oh, I notice I'm having new thoughts. But the I identifying the thinking is changing. Let me try to say that a little bit better. If you can say, I don't think I thought that before, you are in the formation of a personality framework that identifies itself by thinking, is shifting. Anybody want to try putting that in a comment and seeing if you can flush it out a little bit? So we think we have a locatable I, but actually the only locatable I we have is in our thinking. Because we cannot touch something, smell something, feel something, see something, hear something without commenting on it or thinking about it. And what we identify as the thinker and the commenter is our I, ourselves. So then you'll say things like, I'm just experiencing life differently now, or things are showing up differently. I'm simply saying that your brain is patterning thinking that allows for you to have access to things that the thinking you thought you before didn't give you access to. It always amazes me that one of the things that happens for a lot of people is when the neural webbing of the brain begins to fragment. In other words, go out of balance. Feels like overly torturous in some manner. Because you have this amygdala and this hippocampus in your brain, one of which holds your basic life, death, survival, and the other one holds memory that supports that life, death, survival. And so what happens in the creation exercises, they actually begin to affect the reactive nature, and this is beyond your gut. Your gut can be going off like a 5 alarm fire. You don't necessarily have to think consistent with what your gut's doing. This is really only about thought, not about experience without thought. But I'd like a few of you to try to tell me an experience without thought, because to tell me the experience, you're going to have to think it to tell me. I'm talking about thinking, strictly unabashed thinking. We do not realize that thinking that is life enhancing, life defeating, and life depleting is actually thought to keep you alive. It's trying to keep you safe. It's having you trying to, it's not like an it, but that's the only way English can talk. It's trying to preserve the species. So it will fire the it will have you hide out. It will give you instructions to hide out, to not be in the world, to not engage with people because the amygdala and the hypothalamus have come together to create a coordinated effort to have you survive at all costs. We're in the midst of a chapter, several actually, but one of the chapters is our survive at all cost mentality, which is not an I thinking, it's a neural programming that we have been organized by for thousands of years, since the beginning. So I just don't know how people are going to do it without the creation exercises. I just don't know how. Because I don't know anything else that penetrates the neural webbing and has a alchemical structure, actually a sacred structure, that allows the patterns to smooth out instead of looping, starting to move into a spiral dynamic that allows us to move out beyond the programming and move out beyond the wiring and create new wiring. I just don't know how people are going to do that without them. And especially the downside is that we identify our thinking as ourselves. How can I'm having terrible thoughts, not there are terrible thoughts trying to get my attention. So it really started to show up when this book started 5 years ago. And I again, speaking to authors as a little bit in this conversation, or even writing, even sending a text or an email or posting on WhatsApp or Telegram, there's, and I'm going to say this badly, but then we'll get into it, hopefully, a little bit more unpacked. We don't really have much capacity to watch where our thinking, i.e., our writing, is coming from. And it has the same neural constriction as our talking and our thinking. But in writing, one of the hardest things, writing you as the mind of creation, was to try to get out of past-based thinking and to be thinking about different aspects of mind. And every word being used in the book is a word created from past-based memory, the words themselves, whoever created them. And one of the first things we noticed as Electra and I, now Heather and I, were going through, two things we noticed. One, often, like intimacy, was particularly fascinating, the word, because it went through several recursions of interpretation. It didn't mean the same now that it meant in its beginning. There was another one too, I don't remember what it was. Empathy. So words don't evolve, but where the words are coming from do. So my first question to you, if you would like to learn to think, is where are your thoughts coming from? The easiest one is what is taught in the LOC Institute. Are they life enhancing or are they life depleting? If they're life depleting, they're based on the past, because the brain has to calls up what will have you survive. So hide, run, or fight. Yourself, usually, if you're alone thinking. So if you have hide, because that's stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. If you're hide, I need to hide out, I need to fight, I need to stop. It's not right or wrong. It doesn't have any interest in right or wrong. It's simply that there's no consciousness that says, well, maybe I don't. And then you check systemically, because you're awake to your system, what choice you're going to make regarding your endeavor that day. So that's why template 3 is so critical, because you can literally rematrix a word into your direct relationship with what you hold to be real. But then the question is, what do you hold to be real? And are you willing to think what you hold to be real? Are you willing to think two things? First one, where is this thought coming from? The easiest one, is it operating on behalf of life, or is it operating as life depleting? And the other, where is this thought coming from? Is this coming from the past? Or is this coming from a framework of future that I hold to be real, that my very language and my very presence and my very being is building, because where I am it is? Against all odds sometimes, because remember, the gut fires, it sends out warnings, skin chills, depression hits, all sorts of stuff happens in the body. But my question is, who is in charge of your evolution? What is in charge of your evolution? The physiological responses of your body and the thoughts, or you? Because you are the observer of your thinking, and you are the observer of your biological body's responses. And that you is not only an observer, it is an observer free of the past, and free of the past in such a manner that it has choice. The other thing that was noticed in the words, particularly the chapters we're getting into now, where we're having to deal with medical terms, is, see, the first thing I said about where your thoughts coming from, what's clear in much writing and much construct of definition, is it's independent of its connection with creation. We have a garage door opening. We may have a car coming out. It's independent of its connection with creation. So this phenomenon of writing is challenging in our present construct of time. It's why storytelling and personal shares become valuable, because it can have people be present to something without having to describe it or give it an explanation or change the meaning of a word. We've had to rematrix word after word after word since we got into the meta body part of this chapter. So the other thing is that the part I'm trying to say is, I got distracted by the garage door opening, is that we are trying to take a language devoid of connection to life, or devoid of connection to like a living field, which you find in poetry and music and sometimes in storytelling, and bring life to it, bring connection to it, put it back in a direct relationship with creation. But that's the same as your thinking. Most thinking is devoid of its direct relationship with creation. And you all know what that's like when it isn't. It's like awe-inspiring and moving beyond measure, and the mental processor is like alive with real, feeling of real. So not only are the words rematrix as cultures change and new words get introduced, but the words that we're presently attempting to use during this time don't give you hardly any direct access to where the words are coming from. They simply describe a place that someone has had an experience of. It's a challenge. So how do you think that might be resolved? And that's when it gets into the juicy part. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this called this way this morning is I do much better in conscious when I'm in my consciousness, and I'm able to be in a field of human beings, and then I draw from the field. Like I said, where does your words come from? Where does your language come from? Where does your speaking come from? Where do your thoughts come from? Are you directing them? Are you letting your thoughts know where they're supposed to come from? Are you directing your own show? So then you kind of learn about things. We have these conversations like we are one or oneness, or my favorite, the one soul human, because that's how I experience the human species. And we run into this thing called a shared mind. So you as the mind of creation is a shared mind. It's not an isolated uh, program of I. And one of the ways you know that your neural programming is stimulating your survival system is that you feel thinking in an isolated I. Now this one's rough. This one this one is why I have a WhatsApp group, why I have a Sacred Space for Rest and Courage group, why I do groups is not because I'm out for groupies or grouping, is because it starts to generate the mind of creation within which we are all one, individual and united. So we have our own framework of thought, but we have a unified field of thinking. Not the words, but the unified field of thinking. So the traditional way to do writing is you write, then you send it to an editor who edits, then they send it back. And I just want you to get the experience of, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm talking about different forms of reality, where things come from, how things exist based on where they come from, where they draw life from. So that's normally how you do it. And then the editor, more than likely, will be looking to see if your words, like when I started with ghostwriters, I considered hiring the mafia because they took everything I wrote and sent it back to me to fit the patterns of thought for the day, for the culture that we're presently in. Trauma, uh, recovery from trauma, thinking. So I just had to toss them because they weren't thinking the thinking that I was thinking from. They weren't able to bridge that gap. And we call it the voice of the author, which is a decent term. So there were two things that I hated about writing. One is that I exist, where my thinking comes from, is I think I thought about this morning. I think the easiest way to say is my thinking comes from a collective response of humanity's activity of consciousness. I think that's pretty valid because all the years I've done psychic work, there's hardly any reading that doesn't say you really put words where I had no words. So I think what I said is valid, that's where I draw my thinking from. And for me, any other kind of thinking is only my point of view, and I should definitely frame it that way, as a point of view, not as a truth, not as what I can give people access to, and not as not what I can give people access to, and not as the answers everything. Because for me, the only thing I pay attention to is building a field within which new futures can rise. And just like all writers and all speakers and any conversation you ever have with anyone, their listening is going to slant your speaking, because their lens of listening is to take care of something that is their concern. So you can't really, I have discovered you can't really work your butt off to try to get every human being or any human being to understand, because they're not, because your understanding and their understanding, there's a uniqueness in each of our listenings that's operating on behalf of our own concerns. That's why resonance language, resonant speaking, resonant listening is so important that builds in the creation exercises. Because then you're listening resonantly, not in the realm of understanding. You don't even have to perceive. You can say, oh, I get that. You can even say, which I have, especially since the polarity of politics, you can say, yeah, I really get that, because you really do get it. And that's not really where I'm operating from. Not really, that's not what I think. Because I could clearly think it if I couldn't hear it, if I couldn't think it. But I'm not operating from that thinking. So here's the miracle of this book. 4 elements I'm going to try to put in language. But the point is, I didn't want to start with talking about the book, because the minute I talk about a book, every concept you have about writing and books mars your ability to hear anything I say, masks it, doesn't let you hear freely. But now I'm going to talk about the phenomenon that has occurred in writing this book, which I am so excited about. This is not the excitement about the book. I'm excited about the phenomenon because the fact it occurred, the fact that it's happening, points to that the human mind, particularly the neural wiring of the human mind, what's so interesting, the other thing that came up, this an aside, is I actually do have a lot of time I don't have thought, a tremendous amount of time. And one of the things that startled me after having COVID is there was such a marked difference between not knowing what I've been doing for the last 5 hours, which is common for people, and realizing that I used to always know. I used to always have a sense of presence during those 5 hours. And I'd lost that sense of presence, that sense of being part of the universe and the universe being part of me, and almost being startled by thought, almost being startled by it. Like I used to call it, I call it checking, my mind checked back in. But that was very startling to me, that I realized that we often call it losing time, but actually it's just that we don't have some of our registers back open that allow us to be present without thought. That was an aside. So it started with Electra and I. So I could have thought it was unique to Electra and I, not that not that a meta state was building, a condition of reality that I had not been present to before. Not the conditioning, but a condition of reality. A meta state is a condition of reality that goes beyond the conditions of reality you've been experiencing up until now. And then you kind of hope that some of these conditions of reality uh, become the common, become a new norm, you could say. So Lecter and I, and you all have heard some of this, some of you, when we began to work on the chapters together, there was a third party. And I know people talk about this in creative endeavors, but I really am talking about consciousness. And I really am talking about mental thought. And I really am talking about human perception. So notice when we use the phrase creative endeavor, or I don't remember, like I'm a singer, so I would have once called it jamming. Uh, and we talk a lot about the creative spirit and how when people come together, they can create these phenomenal events. But where's that thinking coming from? What is the structure of consciousness that thinking is coming from? Same thing with what's the word? Mass hysterics. You know, someone lights a match in a crowd of thought, and the crowd swells with that thought. You either lynch somebody or you panic and try to run for the door, trampling each other. That's a non. That's coming from fear and things that often we have no say over in the moment. I'm talking about the other end of it, where thought patterns begin to, and the problem, even though I am really thrilled, there's some words for all this now. There's haptic cognition, there's, I think it's embodiment cognition. I'm thrilled with these words because these words give something a place that didn't have a place before in the activity of our own consciousness. It's just we want to be in the miracle of what the words are giving us access to in our own perception. So as Electra and I began to write, there was clearly a third party. It wasn't like being in a room with a bunch of ghosts or angels or entities. There was a consciousness, a real definite consciousness, and we called it the consciousness of the book. It worked. I mean, it seemed to be that creation had found our location, our loca, writing the book, and was participating. And of course, the more you do the creation exercises, the more those neural webbings of your mind can move with informing the field and then being informed by the field. So we were being informed by the field. But it was fascinating because it began to create synergetic awareness that neither of us had ever experienced before. We were within something. If I said it in a kind of a it way, we were within something that was really supporting the shift of our neural wiring in a manner that I don't think she or I would have ever been able to apply independent of the fact that we were in an effect that was creating a synergetic rearrangement of our neural wiring. And this is the part I actually am doing this call to try to get this said. It wasn't bringing a logical sequence of thought together and figuring out how to string a sentence. It was different. And how we observed it, because you couldn't manhandle it, is one of the basic premises of the language of creation, which just still kind of shakes my booty. And that is, Electra would say exactly what she saw, exactly what she was present to, exactly what she'd opened up into, using her framework of language, her mental perception of language, of what she was present to. Her, we could say her beliefs or her rationale or her understandings. We could use all that, but not in this frame. In the frame of the mind of creation, they were being she was saying what she was present to, she was saying what she was opening up into. Some of it I didn't understand at all. And then I would respond back to her, and I would be coming from my perception, my way that thought occurs, my framework of reality, hers from her framework from reality. We began to get a real sensory register for when we weren't drawing from the field, or the question I asked you is actually better than what I said. Where is are your thoughts being drawn from? And we began to get a sensitivity of this sort of meta state shift of our thoughts seem to be being drawn from what we can call the field, but unfortunately that stops the show. That doesn't, there's this thing called the field we're drawing from, it has an address. It isn't like that. It's like being in a living mind of creation and being in its neural wiring and its neural wiring, taking Electra's thought patterns, taking my thought patterns, taking where they're coming from, rearranging everything in a new, coherent, cohesive, congruent manner, and then suddenly we'll be correcting. Well, it used to be suddenly. Now it's more like we can feel like when you learn to shift from first to sixth gear. We can feel it starting, and we can feel it shifting, and we just keep surrendering into it, and we just keep doing what's up. And we don't make any comments about our thinking anymore. We don't identify the thinking as ourselves anymore. We don't comment on how we think anymore. Or we do actually do that sometimes because we're tracking where our thinking's coming from. But then something happens. It can happen in one sentence. It can happen in rearranging a paragraph. And then all these paragraphs afterwards, this is where you see it the most strongly, that we thought we were going to have to go through and edit, they've been rearranged. Not in words, but in a fit with what we just did. And none of this fits in the pattern of writing that I'm used to, nor was she used to. And so it really is these creation exercises that they seem so mundane, and which is really, really hard to make a steady practice, have huge results. And we also operate as a collective. We stay in a shared field of interactive, interrelated, symbiotic sharing. Like someone said, there's just too much information on the WhatsApp thread. Well, what does that have to do with anything? It's not informational. It's building a field within which the mind of creation can rise, and our unique and essential aspect of that, being one with creation, unique individually and collectively, being the mind of creation, individually and collectively. And basically, Electra and I got that experience. So hence Heather comes on the scene. And she's coming. We have to write about that most gnarly part of the book. Things like the medical world. The medical world that, talk about a dead language, a mechanistic fix your car language. And yet somehow it's ours to do. And, but then the same thing started up again, because it's like, if you've ever been to Hawaii, but in a lifetime, you can see an island, small island form outside away from the island, the Hawaiian island itself, because it's formed by lava. It rises, it rises from the bottom of the ocean, and it's a place you can go. I was trying to think of the island. I can't think of it right now. That in our history, it's a that island formed. It's like that when a field becomes available. It doesn't become available to a few. It becomes available as as something to draw from, just like humanity's been drawing from fear and terror and trauma all these years. There is a mind of creation that operates beyond that, that we're starting to draw from. We're starting to draw from its mental, from our ability, for our mental construct of thought to be able to recognize, and truthfully, we recognize it through resonance. It's very much like poetry. When a poet gets the poem done, he or she is not really thinking about how people will take it or if they'll understand. The poet can really feel the movement of creation in their words, and they know that that movement of creation will transfer into the reader, regardless of understanding. So then when Heather and I started working with much more gnarly topics, much more separated from life, and even how life works, activity, that aspect began to that phenomenon of field phenomenon of the mind of creation began to just was there. It's like we think of getting in our car and driving to the grocery store. This is very different. This really is, if you build it, it will come. And in the doing the creation exercises all these years, we have built it, and it has come. And nobody in the whole world needs to know about it. Nobody. Because it was just a missing element of existence that a bunch of human beings craved. And it had a place to restore a fundamental aspect of our so above, so below consciousness. So it's another way to say it is it's becoming more and more the water we swim in. And it's fascinating to watch. It's just fascinating to be available to it. It's natural. It's innate. So it's like feeling something natural and innate rise in yourself, that you don't have to identify it. You can't make it happen. You can only recognize it when it is there. But this morning is a primary example, and it really takes relational fields. You know, fear really separates us from life, and it really separates us from each other. It's a cruel master, and it does have mastery over the human race. So there is obviously, from the day I met Electra and the day she wanted to structure LOC, I trusted her. It required no evidence. Template 3. Template 4. I completely trusted her. She was being what was hers to be. Never required evidence, never had conditions, never had any qualifications. It was clearly her address within which creation would rise. It could be in a year, it could be in 10 years, it could be a few lifetimes from now. But that's resonance. That's the resonance of creation. When Heather met me, this weird psychic, I was in the door for her, regardless of what her thinking was around my industry or anything. It was just relational. The relational field of our, remember the phenomenon of, in a reality of separation, we are separated from ourselves, others, and life. And in a reality of unity, we are not separated from ourselves, each other, or life. And those were those phenomenons, those two phenomenons. I have it with everyone. But when it's up close and personal, operational in activities or actions, it's remarkable. It's a different perception of relating. It's just a different perception of relating. But that perception of relating, that connection, it lives in this kind of amazing phenomenon of when it's what there is for someone to do. It's their expression of creation. It's their being informed by the field and operating consistently with that information. And so when I say I trust someone, I trust them because they've been informed by the field of creation, and they're operating consistently with what they've been informed by. And I'm aware that most human beings think that the doing of human beings is either for or against life, but that's the reality of separation. It's very different than with another in the field. It's a different context of perception starts to occur. But I've never brought it into a process I hate, which is writing. I've never had the opportunity to actually, between Heather and Electra and one other item I'm going to bring up, I've never had the opportunity in a medium that I absolutely abhor because I can't hear in it. I can hear in speaking, I can hear in listening, but I can't hear in writing until Heather and Electra are present. And then their words on the page leaves themselves behind on the page. And in that relational field of being in unity with another who's in unity with life, because coming together to create this book is a way of being in unity with creation in a shared field of consciousness. I woke up this morning, we're talking about feedback loops. I mean, how romantic is that? And suddenly, I had sent it to Electra. This is an example of the miracle. I'd sent it to Electra because I said, I'm stymied here. I can't get the relational field. I can't get it to give access. I'm clear there is access. I'm clear it's a showstopper if we can get access. I just can't do it. Interestingly enough, I woke up this morning and I got an access, but I only got access choppy. So then Heather walks in the door, said she's going to take a walk. I basically said, no, you're not, because you got to look at this. You got to look at this feedback loop thing. And then she started talking, and her language coming out of her mouth was also choppy, but the like I've got goose pimples, but the crackle in the air was there. The liveness of creation was crackling in the air, and we didn't. And this thing that I just always hate about what words do I use and how do I structure the words and how do I structure the paragraph and how do I do, and of course in my way of speaking, being able to be clear according to the norms of the day is practically impossible. But now it's not like that at all because it's in the phenomenon of creation itself. And then the third aspect of this, it really showed up in the Minding You as the Mind of Creation call that was done yesterday morning. That's when this building island of consciousness, which is able to have a place again in the collective perceptive, collective activity of the neural wiring of humanity. In other words, those of us that are part of the field of Tantra Mat, I don't care what people think that means, but the, the key element of that is that we have a place to play. We have a place to become present to these phenomenons in the WhatsApp, and now we're establishing Tapatalk and the Guardian and Magi and anyone else that participates. It's not limited to people, it's a field phenomenon. But most people don't have a place to practice. They don't have a practice to be present to these phenomenons. They're caught in the mesmerization and identification of the reality of separation. But the more we build, whoever the we is, which includes people that sort of trip in the door every now and then, or a little bit more than that, but as we keep building the field, it bleeds out because it is the natural, innate state of creation here. So yesterday, and some of you already know what happened because you were on the call, and for those of you that like to study consciousness, which of course I love, you might want to purchase the call. It's $11, I think, because it's a real study in consciousness and how it translates into mental activity, especially the last half. So there was a chapter which I've never read on homeostasis. And I've never read a chapter that I wasn't settled inside of. This chapter I was completely not settled. But as I read it into the field, you could hear the dissonance and the cacophony and a couple of times the mental mind just went wacko, and then hyperstimulation occurred and upset and all this dissonance and what's the word I want? The inharmonics were really, really clear. Of course, most people think people-centric. I think feel-centric. So it's very exciting because the dissonance, the disconnect, the inharmonics in the chapter, this is the phenomenon of creation, because when you're present to what you're present to and you open up into what you're experiencing, because I went around and had everybody share their experience, creation hears, because creation, it's like prayer. Creation only seeks to bring everything to the next greater whole. And so I sent some instructions out. I needed a couple of direct quotes that came out of the conversation. So I wrote Praline and Liz got them back to me. And then I asked the Sentinels, which is Heather's group, and then I wrote back to the people who are on the call, I'd really like you to listen to the second half of this call. I need your experience. I need your shares. I need to hear. I need to hear, because alone I can't hear. And once I can hear, because I carry that capacity, the collective consciousness of something out where we're in unity with creation, or out here where we're in unity with creation, then I can find language. Then I can find articulation. And in the shared field of now Heather and Electra and I, because we're now swapping Google Docs back and forth everywhere, now we can bring this meta body using medical terms and reinstating them as a living field. We can bring it into existence. And we will. We all will. Not we three. We all will. Because that's what humanity is. Humanity is we all bringing things into existence, each in our own unique and essential way. Now, the last thing I want to say is more sad for me. That's an expressive. And I think it's going to take a muscle, an emotional muscle, perhaps for a lot of us. In the spiral of being, a human being is not meant to be isolated. In this present epicenter of terror, It's just like a fever. It doesn't have anything to do with the future. Just like a fever doesn't have anything to do with you living a long and healthy life. But I always knew this time would come. And the fact I knew was really fine with me if it didn't come. A lot of people need to be right. I sometimes really would prefer to be wrong. But I was a concern for it, which of course is what started the spirals of being, started the field of Tantra Mat, started everything I've done. Um, and that is that I think we're going to have to have some muscle for the mental processor taking over human beings' mind. They are in the terrors of the species past and think it's all going to repeat itself again. Not just the events, but the thinking is the same thinking. The perceptions are the same perceptions. What's wrong here? What's wrong with them? What's wrong with it? What's wrong with me? The fundamental ones. And that the sympathetic nervous system is becoming hypercharged. And one of the things COVID provided, the stillness that COVID provided, not COVID the disease, but the actions that humanity took in the face of COVID, was that we got to be still, we got to be stopped. It's also my personal opinion, and also Heather's, that we think the amygdala is shifting. Hi, Linda. Linda is the one that contacted me about Daniel, for those of you that are in transmutative wholeness, who's on right now not having to breathe on his own, being supported by a breathing machine. We're part of his healing. So I just wanted to recognize you. So we have to have some muscle for that. Because if you build it, if you stay true, if you work with yourself and others on behalf of building a field within which no futures can rise, on behalf of all life, what connects us to life and has us exist as a whole, in all its multiple frameworks and its multiple colors, then it supports everything. It supports everything. And the collective mind of humanity, less and less people will get lost in the terrors of the species of the past. That's really the last thing I wanted to say today. And then I want to say something about the book. For those of you who have been doing the creation exercises or have been inside the ontology and phenomenon of the work of Tantra Mat, you're going to love the book because it's going to give framework of thought to things you've been experiencing. For people who have not been in that conversation, it's going to be curious because it's a real rotor of the mental mind. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. And last of all, thank you for today. And thank you for your listening. Because I read on the WhatsApp thread today, something's changing, something's happening. I also could feel the flavor of it might not necessarily be pleasant. But why do we have to pay attention to that? When there's so much amazing happening that's beginning to bring to consciousness new systems of thought, new systems of perception, new systems of experience. And that, what if we could really concentrate, as Jim just wrote, on just building the field wherever we have the opportunity. Namaste.